Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining here on time for another Academist micro lesson. I don't think I can say that 3 times in a row right now. Anyways, welcome to our Academist micro lesson on learning design, and in particular, co-constructing learning. That will be presented to you by Stuart McAlpine. He'll be introducing to us not only how do you co-construct content, but he'll be providing tips on process and aligning it to cultural frameworks. Stuart has worked with Academists for a number of years. I remember when I first met him at UWC and how impressed I was by him. And when he came to speak for Academists and did a number of workshops, the feedback has been phenomenal. Since that time, though, he has gone on a bit of a journey from Singapore to New Zealand. Now he's in Europe. And if there's anything that I could probably, if I had to summarize who Stuart is and what he does, he's like a curriculum scientist. With that said, Stuart, maybe you can give us a little bit more of an introduction about yourself, where you're at now, and then we can get started right into the topic.
That'd be amazing. It's very nice to meet everyone and see some familiar faces. So yeah, so I'm in Denmark at the moment. Yeah, and what I love doing is I love program design, which would include curriculum, but also the teaching and learning of that curriculum. And I've worked in refugee contexts and I've worked in international school contexts. At the moment, I'm a director at the Lego Foundation, where I run the Playful Schools initiative, which sort of connects and empowers schools who are pursuing learning through play kind of globally, and does work with other global organizations to support that. But what I love doing best is kind of making learning and teaching stuff is what I really like doing. So we'll have a little look today at co-construction. So Mike has asked me to talk for just around 15 minutes. And so I'll just talk, share some slides, and then I think there's just time for sort of dialogue and conversation or questions. We're looking at sort of co-constructing learning together, and this comes from the forthcoming sort of workshop, and it's about a half of the way through. But we're just pulling this little bit as a little sort of nugget that you might be interested in or might find useful. Learning design and program design has principles and elements, just as every other kind of design or creativity does. And these are the set that I use. And this is particularly exploring principles around identity and purpose and around meaning. And what we're talking about is we're talking about creating learning with people, not for them, and maybe putting ourselves slightly more in a position of listening more than we're telling. And we'll just explore both a little bit of the why and then some hows, which are really straightforward. So hopefully you'll look at the hows and think, oh yeah, that's kind of straightforward, that would work, because it does work, because I've done it, it works. A question around the why is like, okay, so why would you co-construct learning, and why would you be interested in that right now, and why would you particularly be interested in that? And some assumptions that I would have are here. So firstly, there's a lot of dialogue globally around diversity, inclusion, and equity, and it's timely, like it's important. And that's around learning has been from the point of view of the teacher or the school. It's often rarely taken into consideration learners' values, experiences, lived experiences, aspiration. It's been a sort of packaged content from the center, and that often marginalizes and excludes, and whether that's from a neurodiversity point of view or a cultural point of view or an ethnicity point of view, or just acknowledging the individual. I think that's an important reason why co-constructing and creating with is better than creating for. I think we're also looking at the end of the industrial model of knowledge and skills transmission as being what schools do. I know we're still stuck in that model, but it's coming to an end. And in a really sort of, you know, VUCA world, in terms of volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world, and a pluralistic world, knowledge and skill are now illustrative, and they have always been for a long time in international schools, but there isn't one set body of knowledge and skill that is the set. And therefore creating opportunities for learners to have voice in that is really important. And the other thing is, in a more sort of focused on your own capacities, if you learn the processes to co-construct learning, you can bring other people into that process with you, and you can bring experts in who will help you do things that you couldn't possibly do on your own. And that's also very exciting and powerful and important. And because you probably need this as a competency, either as a teacher or as a leader or as a curriculum person, it's hard to imagine asking someone, could you co-construct the learning around this particular unit with the learners, and someone saying they can't do it. That's a problem. In my role, I've been a principal, like it's a problem if people can't do that, because it's becoming increasingly important. And I often see it lacking, and I'm often asked to help, which reinforces my sense that it's an area of challenge. And the what is, I guess what we're talking around really is, you can co-construct, at its simplest, you can co-construct the content and the what. And we I'm going to associate that with knowledge. It's not that straightforward. But you could have that co-constructed with the learner rather than the teacher deciding. And you could also do on the other side, something more about the process of learning could be co-constructed. And you could associate that with skills. That's an oversimplification, but it kind of works. And you could do both. Obviously, if you're starting off, it's easier to do one than both at the same time. So I would recommend starting with one and making sure that's comfortable. And that's essentially at its simplest what we're talking about. And then that takes us to a how. So the first thing is you need a space. And I know with COVID times, you may not get a space in terms of physically being with learners and having enough space, but it's a really simple thing. It reminds me of Virginia Woolf saying, all a writer needs is a room of one's own. But you need a decent space. MIRO works online fantastically well, but a large space where you can put out ideas, go through a double diamond design cycle and see that sort of big splurge of ideas and organize them and sort them. So the space really matters. And MIRO works great if you're online. And if you're not online, get yourself a big space. This was a lovely space when I was in New Zealand. We used a lawn, and you can see a sort of co-constructing outside. Joy other days. But MIRO works fine. Okay, so what, and this is learners doing it. So if we're co-constructing knowledge, in the past, if we're learning a particular concept, and I think this works for all disciplines, like we can talk about that, but it works for all disciplines. If we're co-constructing knowledge, normally the teacher would choose both the case study that illustrates the concept that's being taught, and normally the context as well, that case study is going to be experienced in. And there is no need. In a world where we're not going cultural transmission, there is no need at all. So simple processes around things like saying, obviously it's easy if you imagine something like, I don't know, history or art, that you could say, okay, industrialization, rather than me choosing the case study, I'm going to choose you. What countries are you interested in? What places have you experienced that are meaningful to you? Or what kinds of industrialization and effects of it are you most interested in? Get them out on cards, group them, sequence them, and it will, and filter them out as work, find areas of common interest, find outliers, and you may be interested and want to get rid of them. But that works incredibly well. And if you said, oh, but I teach science, I can't do that, you probably can actually, to be honest. So if you had like, and I'm not a science teacher, but if you had sort of electricity, rather than saying, okay, it's a sequential learning pattern that I have to decide in advance, all of it's abstract, and I'm just going to talk you through the concepts and work you through examples. One could say, what are the contexts in which electricity is meaningful or useful to you, how it's generated, how it's used, get them all out, group them, sequence them. And then from that, as a science teacher, you look at it and say, okay, I can get my Ohm's law in here, and I can get the electron pieces in there, and I can get the generation of magnetic fields in when I do that bit. But it's rarely done, which means that thing around identity and ownership of someone saying, you know, we come from a shipping culture and we're really interested and obsessed by ships, and like, can we look at how electricity is used and generated on ships? Do they do it off the engine? Do they batteries? Do they like, how do they? There is no reason not to make the learning meaningful. It's more enjoyable as a teacher to create, and it's much more meaningful and connecting for learners. Obviously, when it comes to anything that's more strongly cultural, literacy, humanities, the examples you choose for your mathematical sort of, it's very doable and it's very easy, and it's very important, and it's transformative because it allows the learners to make connections to their lived experience. And so the simple sequence is, the first diamond of the double diamond is choices around illustrative content. You don't need to choose the illustrative content anymore. And you can even have, is this illustrative content the entire class is using, or do we have our personalized examples and apply concepts to them? And likewise, the context in which those illustrative examples appear in. You can prioritize and select, you can affinity map them of like, okay, if you're interested in doing these things, they kind of cluster up like this. Let's give it a name and let's produce the sequence. And then you get your learning sequence out of it. And it's relatively straightforward, and I've done it many, many times, and it works, and it's fun, and it's meaningful, and it engages learners. And there's an example of people working for a refugee context of language learning, and you can see them beginning to like sort cards, group, prioritize, select, and that's exactly what they're doing. Like, these are the things we think are important. This is how we think they cluster. This is a diamond rank of how important they are. This is an overarching, and you can just do that work, which is why you need the space. For skills and processes, so looking at the other side, we said, well, you can co-construct the content, but you can also co-construct the process side of learning. There's a lot more to say on this, which we won't have time for, but I'll go for the simplest one, which is most skills and most subjects that have skill at the heart also have a process at the heart. So whether that's the creative process or the design process, or we're into P, that would be sort of, invasion games have a process of offense and defense, and that too can be very effectively co-owned and co-constructed. The example you see there is actually, it was a fashion designer who wanted to work with students to help them learn around fashion. And the first thing you do is you say, okay, what are the stages of the process? So she named them out and said, this is what I do when I make clothes. You do vision board, you do design, you do resourcing, you do construction, and you name the sections of the process. You can then think of the micro skills that are needed within that. And then the teaching becomes teaching micro skills in mini lessons. And it can work very similar to sort of readers writers workshop if you're doing that, but you don't lockstep the students into where they are in the process. So you have, here's our process board, which elements of the process are you working on right now for your product? I'm working on resourcing, or someone else might say I'm working on design. And as soon as they say that, you can say, okay, of all the things that we've learned about design, the sort of micro skills that sit under that, which ones are you going to be working on this lesson? What are you going to be applying? And you've got the accountability piece, but with a co-construction around where they are in the process. And you may add steps to that process based on feedback to the learners. I'll show you something next that does that. One of the things I like doing was, if a learner's coming to a class and you have the process up on the wall, you can just say, like, grab a post-it, write your name on it, stick it on which bit of the process you're on. They stick those post-its up, and then you say, okay, we've got 4 people working on design. Can you come over here right now, sit on the carpet with me, and we'll do a little bit of work on design. And so there's a nice kind of co-construction thing. Something that I really, really love, because my friend Elizabeth McClure created it, and I think it's amazing, is she made this with MIT Media Lab. And what it is they identified the generic steps of a creative process, and then you have bricks for each stage of that process, multiple, so lots and lots and lots of share bricks, for example, in the kit. And then you just say to learners, like, when you create something, what do you do, or what do you think you do? And they can make this, and they can have piles of the same brick, and they can have multiple streams, and you can read it from left to right or back to forward, however you want to go. But they create what they think their process is. And so if you're an art teacher, you could do this, or if you're a design teacher, or if, or in any subject where you're making stuff, or you're engaged in creativity. And then that's your accountability piece. They can sit on their desk, and then you can walk up and say, what are you working on? And you say, okay, I'm working on the dare bit where I just try it. And you say, again, back to, and what are some of the strategies you're using to do that? And then they can start moving the bricks around when they go, like, actually, I'm not ready to test. And I thought I was, but I'm not. I'm going to move it back. I thought that's what my process was, but that is not my process. And you kind of get that metacognitive piece around what's the process I, as an individual learner, use to sort of make sense of things or create things. So I really like that. And you could take the idea very easily and adapt it. Like, you can do that on a MIRO board. You can make your own pieces, and then you could ask them to describe their process. So we've done sort of first knowledge, now the process bit. So the simple steps of the process are create the stages of the process. And you can either, like, make that together, or if you really think there are only 5 steps and the learners have no voice there, then that'd be disappointing, but okay. But create the steps of the process. You can sequence them, either say this is the sequence, but you can move around it, or they can create their own sequence of this is how I think I approach things. And then you release control of the stage that they're at, but you teach into the stages, and then use the process as your accountability, because you should be able to ask. And it breeds a huge amount of really well scaffolded independence and choice making, because you can't say, well, I'm going to do this strategy because it's what you taught me last lesson and I don't really know why I'm doing it. Because actually you've decided you're at this stage of the process, therefore you have decided which strategy to use. And it's a very easy to scaffold conversation if someone's unsure. Like if a learner says, oh, but I don't know what to do, I say, well, what have we learned about construction or fashion garments? Or what have we learned about editing your work? Or what have we learned around ideation? And then they can go back, look at, okay, I've got 4 tools I can use. I better use one of them. Which one matches my intent? And then the final one of doing is, like, these are examples from New Zealand, because that's where I did a lot of co-construction last year, but it would apply to any cultural context, is often sort of indigenous ways of knowing, or just cultural ways of knowing the world, often come with a kind of cosmology and a kind of way of structuring experiences or understanding things, which can also be used to frame learning. And that's really important if learners can recognize their own sort of cultural iceberg in what they're doing. So an example is, in New Zealand, we had a Green School diploma framed out around a sort of connection to nature, doing place-based, and we wanted the sequence that connected it to an actual journey. So we're doing sea, upriver, onto land, under land through caves, then up onto mountain. And we're working with local sort of Maori community members and leaders, and a number of them mentioned, okay, but the traditional Maori pipiha, which is how you introduce your cultural identity, actually goes, this is my mountain, this is my river, this is my... And so why don't we match the cultural framework to the learning framework, so that what you're doing is you're getting to know the landscape, is also getting to know a Maori cultural construct of how identity works in a sort of related to place. So we reframed that, which was fine. It was quite a lot of work. And so that's the other thing, is like keeping an open mind, going, right, we're just going to have to rewrite 2 years worth of learning and rechange the order. But it's worth doing. And same thing for the health framework was around Te Whare Tapawha, like the 4 walls of well-being, which is a Maori construct of well-being. If you're not Maori, it's a chance to engage with another cultural framework and understand the way that people in a particular place have understood the universe and themselves. And if you are Maori, then it's an opportunity to see your culture and your way of understanding the world kind of like played out in your learning, rather than always feeling you have to leave that outside. But I'm sure, like in any, you're all teaching in diverse cultures, and with a range of like worldviews around you. And so my assumption is that it wouldn't be terribly difficult to explore some of those with learners or with their families and communities, and look at ways in which that kind of can be brought into the co-construction. And so again, simple steps is just identify what frames and assumptions are meaningful collaboratively, keep an open mind, explore the cultural implications of those together with the community, because obviously there are dangers as well as opportunities in, getting things wrong, or, being crass, or, inappropriately sort of using things that shouldn't be used. But in dialogue, that becomes much easier. And if it's co-constructed, it becomes very easy, because you're not making those decisions on your own. And then use them to form a sort of culturally sensitive narrative, understanding that there isn't one cultural narrative for any community or society, but using models that help people explore a range of ways of understanding the world. And then that's back to the why. So why did we look at 3 different ways of, which are very sort of straightforward. None of them are kind of magic, like they're just pragmatic, straightforward ways of co-creating things that I've found useful and have found have worked. And again, it's back to those, some of the principles of what good learning is and good programming is that it reflects identity and purpose, like shared and individual identity and purpose, and that it has meaning for people. And I think those are the two sort of elements and principles of learning design that this would help you sort of bake into your way of operating and working. Cool, and that's it.